Okay. So welcome everyone, first and foremost, to the Ontario Farmland Trust's winter webinar series. And today is an exploration of innovative approaches to conservation. And we're really pleased that we have a good number of folks joining us today to be a part of this discussion and explore these innovative approaches that we're going to be talking about today. My name is Martin Stradoff. I'm the Executive Director at the Ontario Farmland Trust. For folks who aren't overly familiar, OFT actually works all across Ontario, but we're centered in Guelph, and that's on treaty lands and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit of the Anishinaabe peoples, who are the original and ongoing protectors of these lands. Guelph resides on Treaty 3 between the Lakes Purchase Territory, representing an agreement and respectful partnership between peoples of different nations. And as settler nations work to reconcile our relationships with Indigenous nations, we want our work at the Farmland Trust to reflect the respect deserved to the legacy of the original caretakers whose stewardship of the land has allowed us to enjoy the land's beauty and bounty today. And especially given the role of land disposition that it has had as a tool of colonization, this context is incredibly important to acknowledge. Throughout the webinar, we're going to encourage people to share comments in the chat. However, if you have questions for the presenters, please submit those in the Q&A feature, and we'll be getting to the questions at the end of the session. If you have similar questions to one that's already been submitted, you can upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up icon, and this will move that question up in the queue so we're able to answer the most popular questions first. We also have Tamara Brown, one of our OFT staff members, joining us today, who's going to be able to provide support during the webinar. So if you are having any technical issues, you can message them directly using the chat feature. So again, for those a little less familiar with the Farmland Trust, we're the only provincial-wide conservation organization with a mission that has a pure dedication to the protection and preservation of Ontario's agricultural landscapes. And so Ontario's prime agricultural land is considered a finite and non-renewable resource that comprises less than 5% of Ontario's land base, making it very critical that we protect it. Farmland, being the literal foundation of the agri-food sector, it provides us with locally produced food, employs more than 860,000 Ontarians, or about 1 in 10 of the province's labor force, and contributes over $47 billion annually to the province's GDP. And it's more important now than ever before that we're protecting these agricultural landscapes. Ontario has lost 20% of our farmland in the last 40 years alone. And according to the agricultural census, the rate of farmland loss has nearly doubled between 2016 and 2021. And once farmland is developed on, it is gone forever. OFT has two main program areas. The first of them and our main activity is the permanent protection of farmland. And we do that by working with farmland owners who want to protect and conserve their lands from future development. And since conservation interests are being considered to have public value, the landowners are also provided with a charitable tax receipt for the appraised value of those interests that they are protecting through a land trust. And it's the Conservation Land Act that is giving agency to private landowners who are motivated by the need to conserve our shrinking agricultural and ecological land to work with conservation nonprofits like the Ontario Farmland Trust to protect their property. And a conservation easement agreement, for those who aren't familiar, is the tool that gives authority to organizations like OFT to use to permanently protect farmland. And it's through these agreements, which are legally binding, where covenants and restrictions are applied to the property that then the land trust enforces. So these agreements are registered on the title of the property, which is how they remain in effect even after the property is sold to a new landowner. I'm going to ask that Tamara provide you with a link in the chat right now that will bring you to OFT's webpage on conservation easement agreements if you have more time and interest to look up this tool. I'll comment also that our other area is our education and community engagement programming. And this includes several outreach initiatives that aim to educate the public on what threatens these lands and how we can collectively work to protect them. So this includes engaging in discussions and commenting on changing land use policy that impacts farmland, and to amplify the voices of organizations that are doing similar work. Today, we have permanently protected 22 properties amounting to over 2,500 acres of farmland across the province. And there's a growing interest in our farmland protection efforts, and we now have over 45 landowners who are interested in protecting their properties through OFT's program. And really, that brings us to the topic of our presentation today. Municipal planners and land trusts often work independently and use different systems towards their conservation goals. Both systems have their strengths and challenges, and yet the two groups are rarely collaborating to effect significant or long-term coordinated protection. So today we have Ian Attridge, Paul Peterson, and Denise van Amersfoort joining us to explore the opportunities and challenges that exist with the increased involvement of private landowners engaging in conservation, and to discuss innovative ways that public policy and private conservation can work in concert. Ian is an ecologist and lawyer who practices and teaches environmental, nonprofit planning and trails law, and has authored numerous publications and policy submissions. Across Canada and beyond, Ian has advised land trusts, nonprofit organizations, landowners, and government agencies at all levels, including the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ministry of Environment in Ontario. And he is currently the chair of the Ontario Land Trust Alliance. Denise is a registered professional planner who has practiced in the County of Huron for the last 15 years. Denise has a master's in rural planning from the University of Guelph and is a passionate advocate for sustainable rural communities. Raised on a farm, Denise's family has farmed in rural Huron County since 1832. And Denise has joined us today in her capacity as a registered professional planner, and her comments are reflective of her position as a RPP, registered professional planner, and not of her employer. Paul is a lawyer with extensive land trust experience. In 2005, he helped draft the Canadian Land Trust Standards and Practice document that guides conservation groups across the country. And today he provides legal counsel for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Ian, Denise, Paul, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and to bring your level of expertise to this discussion. To start off, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're talking about two different frameworks for land use and conservation. There's the municipal planning framework and the private and legal frameworks that allow us to use conservation easement agreements. So to start off, actually, I'm going to hand it over to Denise. Denise, I'm wondering if you can start off by providing some insight on what you see as some of the strengths and challenges of achieving conservation goals of a municipality through the land use planning framework.
Yeah, happy to. Thanks, Martin. I think from a very broad perspective, when we think about provincial policy in Ontario, clearly we have the provincial policy statement outlining what are the areas and the resources that we should be concerned about when we think about conservation of resources in Ontario, farmland certainly being one of them. And there's many ways in which planners and planning documents do this very well, right? We have robust systems that take a multidisciplinary approach. We have policy frameworks that cover obviously wide geographies. We are able to provide more specific direction in certain geographies. We incorporate public engagement. We think about what are the values for the public interest over the long term. And so I think there's many things that land use planning does well. In terms of challenges, municipalities are creatures of the province, and there are times at which there's provincial goals that may not match entirely with municipal goals. And I would use the example of recent discussions that we've seen about boundary adjustments across southern Ontario, where in the province certainly had a different idea, I think, than some of the local communities and the local municipalities that were affected by those decisions. So I think that's an example of where, you know, the planning system, while we certainly have systems to look at boundary expansions and comprehensive reviews and whatnot, there certainly are limitations to what we can do from a planning perspective, based on, you know, political will at the time.
Yeah, very interesting, and you know, it's true to think about how robust this system is, of course, but yes, we're exactly as you said, creatures of the province from a municipal perspective. I'm going to hand it over to both Paul and Ian. Maybe we'll start with Paul, actually. If you're able to discuss some of the strengths and challenges of land trusts and conservation easement agreements that you see.
I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you. Thanks, Martin. I think that a key idea at the heart of this is that the private conservation work by land trusts, the conservation easements, the acquisition of land is all private and contractual business, in contrast to the public planning system of zoning and official planning and tools like that. So the conservation easements and the work that the land trust can do is more limited in the geographic scope that it can tackle. It has to tackle a property at a time. It has to get it registered on title, whereas zoning and official planning and provincial policy can cover all of the county or all of the Southern Ontario for that matter. But the conservation easement and land trust work has the advantage that it can go a little bit further than might be politically acceptable or palatable with the land use planning system. For example, if there was an area in which there was a community support and you wanted to protect farmland to the maximum degree, private covenants could really restrict the nature of the land use and even control, for example, land division and subdivision to an extent that went beyond what the public planning system could do. So that's maybe a key idea. I'll leave it at that and ask Ian as well.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Paul. And over to you, Ian.
Thanks very much, Martin and Paul. That was a great introduction. I think these conservation easement agreements, one of their real strengths is their flexibility in design, that they can be set up to match the conditions on the land, the planning for the future, the needs of the parties, whether it's the Ontario Farmland Trust or other land trusts. Municipalities can hold these, of course, and so there's a real opportunity to negotiate the details that will work for the parties, for the interests, for the values on that landscape and plan for the future. And that is, we can also see some of the zoning that may set that up in the land use planning system, but typically that's in a more generalized fashion. And conservation easement agreements can really focus on the particular property and needs there. I think land trusts can also step beyond some of the limitations that municipalities may find themselves in, whether it's the scope of their authority under legislation, under the Planning Act, etc., and also the political context in which they work. So I think land trusts can really draw on multiple skill levels. Typically, the boards and volunteers involved with land trusts are representing quite a diverse skill set and connections in the community. They bring voices from the community, sectors that perhaps don't get the same profile, to that envisioning of the future of the community and using creatively tools such as conservation easement agreements to bring that vision to reality, parcel by parcel. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Excellent. Thanks for that, those additional comments, Ian. And I think it's, you know, evident just from hearing the three of you talk, just to provide this context, that there's some clear strengths, particularly when we're thinking about planning the vast geography that can be protected at a time through policy, but perhaps changing interests at the provincial level can have some significant impact on what that protection once was. But then at the same time, you know, there's those strengths of the flexibility that you're describing, Ian, and yet at the same time, it's so concentrated into parcel by parcel experiences. And so thinking about some of both the strengths to achieve the conservation goals of the communities, but also, you know, being faced with some of the limitations and without coordinated approach, we can be creating some new challenges down the road. And so I'll actually pass this over to Denise. I'm wondering if you can comment on that idea around those conflicting challenges, despite, you know, both having some good strengths to them as well.
It's interesting. I think there is this idea that, you know, a landowner choosing to enter into a conservation land easement is a very, you know, well-intentioned idea, right? They want to see their lands preserved, and certainly there's a lot of value in that broadly. I think where I see the potential is if there's not really high level of coordination between the planning system and conservation land easements. And the example I'll use is wherein, you know, if we see conservation land easements, let's say, for example, that were applied inside of a growth boundary. What we have there is communities that we've done, you know, detailed planning, lots of public consultation, made investments based on the understanding that this is within a growth boundary, and then to have a conservation land easement applied, you know, there's this question of what happens to that parcel over time. Is it leapfrogged? Does it actually have the effect of holding the line, which is maybe what that private landowner was thinking about? But again, there's that public interest piece that I think does need to come into it. Outside of a growth boundary line, I think is where this conversation is extremely interesting and more valuable to think about. You know, how can we use conservation or how conservation easements be used to really enhance that idea that, you know, the demand for more housing and the farmland protection they're not exclusive ideas. To quote the OFA, they are actually, you know, two sides of the same coin. And if we coordinate, there's a lot of potential that can come from using both systems.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I like that quote that you provided as well, right? Because I mean, within the agricultural sector, concerns around housing availability is just as much as a concern for being able to house workers with the next generation of farmers that are coming in. And you know, we have a lot of discussions about affordability, often at the you know, urban landscape side of things, but that's a growing concern as well in the rural landscape as well. And housing affordability and availability is critical to a viable agricultural system as well. So yeah, thanks for those comments. I think it'd be interesting now if we do a bit of a transition into think about what types of examples are out there where we can take these either two approaches or something that's been combined, maybe something that reflects what Denise was commenting on around this idea of being able to take this high level coordinated approach to be able to achieve these types of protections of public interest, where there is agency provided to private landowners, but it still meets that overall objective that maybe the entire community has as well. So as we move over into some examples, I'll start with Paul this time. If you're able to share some examples that you've seen around some interesting ways of protecting public interest of conservation.
Thanks, Martin. I'm going to talk about examples from Alberta and Maryland, and a brief reference to something in Ontario. And I should just say that I work part-time for the Nature Conservancy of Canada, but I'm also a lawyer in private practice. And my comments today are just my comments. I'm going to talk about Nature Conservancy projects, but I'm not here representing NCC today. Maybe I will talk first about the points Denise raised about where are these tools most effectively or intelligently applied. And it was only, I think, yesterday evening I went and looked at in more detail at some of the material from the state of Maryland, which has one of the best recognized farmland protection programs in North America. a percentage of the real estate land transfer tax is actually devoted to farmland and other open space protection. And there's government, and some of it goes to land trusts, and some of it is direct acquisition of conservation easements by government agencies. So there's a high degree of coordination there. It's state policy to protect these key farmlands. But it was interesting when you dug into it and the eligibility criteria, they specifically say that where land is designated in a 10-year plan for sewer and water service, they wouldn't fund a conservation easement there. And I was thinking the same thing without looking at Maryland, because my background's in land development and municipal planning law. And I thought, you don't want to be spending your resources on a conservation easement on land that is either inside or going to be inside a publicly funded sewer and water service area for urban development. That just wouldn't make sense. So it was interesting in Maryland that they said, well, that wouldn't be eligible for our program. And on the flip side, the farmland protection organizations there, and I saw examples in New York State as well, they do planning in cooperation with the government on identifying where are the key farmland protection areas. Where is there a viable community of veterinarians and farm supply stores and everything else that the farm community needs? Where do we have really viable farm communities that we want to protect? And we'll prioritize our land trust and conservation easement efforts there. So I hope, of course, this is a big topic, but it's a beginning of an answer to the issues that Denise was raising. One other example I wanted to talk about where we've really seen this applied at a large scale is outside of Waterton National Park, right at the Montana border in Alberta. Fabulous geography if you've never seen it. The prairie just crashes into the mountains. They didn't bother with foothills there. They just went prairie, mountain, and the transition is very dramatic and very beautiful. But a problem was identified that the grizzly bears and the elk and all the wildlife from the Rocky Mountain parks want to use that grassland area at the foot of the mountains. And so from a conservation biodiversity point of view, NCC, Nature Conservancy of Canada, started a large program there of acquiring land and conservation easements just outside of Waterton National Park. And the beauty in Alberta and in the prairies, I could spend the whole day talking about our work on the prairies, but the grasslands, the ranching grasslands, are considered to be completely compatible with Nature Conservancy biodiversity objectives, because grassland, native grassland, is one of the most endangered landscapes in Canada. And the ranchers want to keep ranching on it, and the conservation organizations want them to keep ranching. So there's a wonderful synergy where NCC and other organizations can go to the ranch owners and say, we'll acquire a conservation easement from you. We'll pay you some percentage of the conservation easement value. You'll get a donation receipt, good against your taxable income for maybe the next 10 years on the rest of the balance of your conservation agreement. And then you will be bound to keep this land in grassland and not convert it to housing development outside the park, or for that matter, to cropland. So it's protecting one type of agricultural land, and that's rangeland, grassland. But it's a fabulously interesting process because the ranchers are thrilled with this. I take it that they're thrilled because we've signed up more than 30,000 acres of land outside of the boundaries of Waterton National Park. And some of it is owned and leased by NCC back to ranchers, and some of it is acquired as conservation easements. And that injection of cash and tax receipts from the conservation easements helps the ranch to keep going. Pardon me, Martin, I'll go on with one other example. This past year, we signed an agreement for a 55,000 acre ranch in Alberta that's mainly native grassland. Fabulous, unbelievable landscape. To be out there, you feel like you're one of the original explorers because you just see wildlife and cattle. I guess the buffalo would have been there, but it's a fabulous landscape. But that rancher, as they say in the prairies, ranching is a lifestyle. It's not a business. So a significant injection of cash and tax receipts from the conservation project, Ducks Unlimited and NCC working together, will fund and help fund that ranching operation for a very long time. So those are examples of injecting cash in. York region in Ontario is one region that takes a percentage of its revenue and devotes it to land securement activities. It's not, I don't think, directed primarily at agricultural land, but in the mixed landscape of Southern Ontario with forests and streams and farmland, certainly some open space land is protected with government funding in Ontario as well. Lots more could be said, Martin, but maybe I should wrap it up there.
Perfect. Yeah, no, thanks, Paul. And one thing that had sort of has a hook in my brain now is thinking about this coordination around the like looking for where there's already farm businesses that are happening and really being intentional around the viability of these farm communities and thinking about the example that you had also said around 30,000 acres is protected through that, and at the start of the slides I had said we've protected 2,500 acres. How incredible would it be to take these types of coordinated approaches to see such significant impact? But going back to the comment on the viable farm communities, I think that's actually a nice segue to maybe chat with Denise about some examples that you have and thinking about rural communities wanting to maintain viable agricultural systems. Taking that approach, do you have any examples that you'd want to share with us as well, Denise?
Yeah, I think the agricultural systems thinking, sort of this, it's not a new idea. In fact, when it first came out, I think the planners in Huron sort of stopped and said, wait, what is this? Because it's sort of inherent in Huron County where we plan, it's inherent to how we think about everything on a day-to-day basis. But recognizing, there's different geographies across the province, the shift to agricultural systems thinking is exactly what Paul was mentioning about this idea that an agricultural system, in order to be not only viable, but prosperous, right, needs all those pieces along the value chain. But underpinning the entire system, the critical component is the land. And so thinking about, how can municipalities potentially work with the Ontario Farmland Trust, similar organizations, to identify pockets wherein additional protection is necessary if we want these spaces to have a viable agricultural economy into the future. And so we sometimes use this term called belts and suspenders, right? Wherein you would think, right, that one system should be able to provide, sufficient protection or minimize risk, if you want to use that term. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. So where could we use a belts and suspenders approach when it comes to thinking about how we protect resources in Ontario? Many planners will be familiar with properties in their municipality wherein a belts and suspenders approach is used in terms of protecting natural spaces. So certainly this idea that the property is designated and zoned for, natural environment is protected. We really limit the idea of what you can do on that property from a land use planning system. But there's also times that those properties have a conservation land easement in which NCC, local land trust, holds that conservation easement to really help protect and shore up that protection over the long term. Could we use that same belts and suspenders approach when it comes to think about agricultural lands? If there are these really key pockets, planning has certainly identified them. If we think nationally, obviously BC's agricultural land reserve might be one of the best examples. I think it's approximately 4.6 million hectares of land protected through that system. In Ontario, certainly the Greenbelt, the Oak Ridges Moraine, how we approach specialty crop areas such as the Niagara region or Holland Marsh. These are all examples of where, the planning system, and sometimes legislation as well, has created a system of protection. Is it strong enough? Or could it potentially benefit from some additional protection in the form of a conservation land easement. And I think that's this whole idea about belts and suspenders is it's about working together, and it's about having a shared vision, a shared goal, and then thinking about multiple tools that can work together. The Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Land Preserve is certainly, I think, something we're going to hear about from Ian in more detail. But that's specific geography in the province that I would say right now is experiencing incredible pressure as a result of its location in the province. Certainly where I practice out in Huron County, if I think of the farm I grew up on, conservation land easement certainly could be applied there. Would it have a lot of protection in terms of the Huron County context? Would it make a significant difference? Not necessarily, but in a place like Dufferin Rouge, I think it absolutely could. And I might just leave it there and let Ian take that one.
Yeah, certainly. That sounds great. Thanks, Denise. And yes, the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve has, I think, have been a very hot topic lately with some of the changing policies that we've seen. So it'd be great to hear a little bit more about that from Ian.
Thanks, Martin. And Denise, I really appreciate your introduction on this topic. You know, the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve has got 50 some odd years of history when one looks back to the province expropriating lands to support the federal airport that was, you know, intended to be in Pickering. And then the province decided to sell off those lands and had to go through an official plan amendment to sell off smaller parcels. And that brought in the involvement of local municipalities and the region of Durham and citizens groups. And it was the citizens groups that really brought this idea of using conservation easement agreements to ensure that these prime agricultural lands could be kept in farming and would not be developed to an extent that would exclude that real prime opportunity for agriculture in proximity to a growing urban area in Toronto and otherwise. And so as part of the settlement of that official plan amendment involving all these provincial lands, conservation easements were put in place to protect both the agricultural parts and then separately with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority for some of the natural areas as well. So what we find with some of these agreements is that they can be used for different kinds of purposes, separately for natural or agricultural water protection. They can also be within a particular parcel, they can have different zones with different types of restrictions on them. So again, as I mentioned, fairly creative. And so I think what we've seen is that the Dufferin Rouge Agricultural Preserve is an opportunity, is an example of an opportunity where conservation easement agreements can be used on a fairly large geography, approaching the scale that zoning and official plans might achieve in a local municipality. So I think there's potential to look for other places. And I appreciate Denise mentioning the specialty crop areas such as Niagara and Holland Marsh, where there are tender fruit lands and vegetable production recognized in the planning system, but these would again be areas that could be targeted for working with landowners, willing landowners to protect those important areas. And that may be seen in perhaps other geographies, whether you're looking at the clay belt, it might be some other places where at a more regional scale, these kinds of important agricultural areas could be identified. I think it's important to recall that the province had identified and set aside millions of dollars to acquire and purchase conservation easement agreements to protect the Niagara tender fruit lands. This was turned over as one of the first acts of the Mike Harris government, but there was an example of where the province was in support, and there were landowners in support and willing to sign up to protect their lands, the specialty area for the future. I think looking for other kinds of wider scale opportunities to partner with land trusts and diverse members of the community to look at adding that layer of protection to the land use planning system, and even adding the potential for looking at land management types of issues, not just land use planning kinds of measures, And these can be included in conservation agreements. I think in particular of Indigenous communities that as part of land claim settlements are getting fairly substantial awards of funds to then go and purchase from willing landowners important lands that might be part of the reserve, might be adjacent to existing reserves, maybe in other centers, other locations, and they have substantial resources. And some examples of those I would offer is the Caldwell First Nations in southern Ontario, down around Point Pelee, and the Williams Treaty First Nations around the Peterborough or Nagojunong area where I live. And in those territories, there's opportunities for those communities to buy land and perhaps put those together with other partners to extend their agricultural uses and harvesting uses on those lands. I'm also thinking of Paul's great example from the prairies. And in Saskatchewan, there's the Treaty Land Sharing Network, where farmers are on a growing scale working with Indigenous communities to enable access and use of their farmlands in order to continue traditional ways and connections with lands for Indigenous peoples. And that's in important treaty territories on the prairies. So I think we can look for various kinds of geographies where partnerships can start to use conservation easements on a wider scale. And there's some in Ontario and certainly examples elsewhere. Oh, I might just add a little further detail about Indigenous communities and using the land trust model and some of these tools like conservation easement agreements. We're seeing the growth of Indigenous land trusts both in Ontario and across the country, where they are forming land trust non-for-profit corporations and charities and are able to enter into conservation agreements or to work with landowners for access, for management purposes, access to garden areas. There's a land trust in the Kingston area that is doing that, an Indigenous-led land trust that is working with the United Church for a garden site just outside of Kingston. So lots of possibilities from the smaller scale to the wider scale.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Ian. And certainly, almost took the words right out of my mouth around there's the clear evidence of the possibilities of what we're able to do when we're thinking creatively around the two models that exist in front of us for conservation and land use planning, and finding these creative and innovative ways to bring these together to be able to do these larger areas of protection, more permanent types of protection. And I appreciate bringing in the considerations around Indigenous conservation as well. And there's a whole lack of opportunities to take both a land trust model and work with Indigenous communities, as well as working with our municipalities. And as I'm thinking about this, it's leading me sort of to our next part of the webinar, is to talk about really what we think are the conditions that are needed in order to pursue these types of innovative ideas and explore what could be done. I'm going to open the floor really to either Ian, Denise, or Paul to take the lead on this. I'm going to limit this part to about 6 minutes, so we have time at the end for questions. But I really just want to think about what do we need to consider in terms of being able to be successful with these kind of grand ideas that have been explored, and to achieve these types of anyways, I'll pause there and I'll turn it over, and you can just jump in with your ideas around this.
Ian, Denise, if you're okay, I'll just jump in on that first. We've talked quite a bit about the tool, the conservation easement tool, and the fact that the land trust can also acquire ownership of land and lease it back and make it available to farmers. We've talked about building community support or working in cooperation with the municipality so that you're all moving in the same direction and not at cross purposes with municipal planning and municipal government. But there's another thing that I think is really worth thinking about, and that is make the business case for whatever initiative you want to undertake. And I gave the example earlier of the conservation and grassland protection on the prairies. And there is the happy coincidence that the conservation biodiversity people and the ranchers they have enough in common that they can work together to protect the grassland, and there's money available to do it. So that's a very compelling business case to the ranchers and the landowners. They're getting what they want, long-term protection of their ranch land. They love that lifestyle and that landscape. They want it kept that way, and so do the conservation organizations. That's a significant leg up that the grasslands have on the prairies. We don't have such a compelling business model for cropland in Southern Ontario, but I think we need to be very clear about developing an attractive, if not compelling, at least an attractive business case for if a farmer doesn't have a succession plan with his family, but wants to see his farm maintained as farmland, is there a donation of land? Is there a donation of a conservation easement? How do we make it available to the next generation of farmers? Follow the money analysis to make all of that work. I'd put, in addition to the planning and the mechanics of the legal tools that the Ontario Farmland Trust can use, what's the business case? We need to develop a strong business case for what we're doing.
Mm-hmm. And I would add on to in addition to the the fiscal side of a business case, it's also the environmental perspective. What is the environmental business case? What is the social business case, right? How can we really show that holding those lines, right? Holding the countryside line, if I think about Waterloo Region, they've done a really great job, I think, in trying to explain the various elements and benefit to the public, at large that will come from us holding that line into perpetuity. What I think needs to be done is that we need to have the confidence that we can meet the demands of our communities now and into the future within those lines. I think there's been a lot of mixed messaging when we're hearing about 1.5 million homes within 10 years and we need more space and we need more houses. I think people truly believe, right? Well, we're going to need more land in order to do that. And so I think we need this real confidence that we can meet the demands, and we need to have support for intensification to do that. So for the planners on the call, for the decision makers, if that line is to be permanent, it is to be a fixed line, how does that change your perspective, your approach, your decisions about intensification projects within your community? I would argue we still have work to do in that area.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And thinking of that business case, I know that the American Farmland Trust has done a lot of work on the economics of growth into the countryside and the disadvantages of that and the costs of expanding infrastructure and the return to municipalities on their taxes for that investment. And so it's different here in Canada, but I think there's some illustrations of some further analysis that will be useful to do in the future. I appreciate Paul's reference to some of the mechanics of how we integrate and encourage the use of conservation easements agreements in appropriate settings. And I think there's some legal reforms that can help us. There's guidance on how a consistent approach to register conservation easements agreements on title, to link the private conservation easement agreement with planning and issuing of building permits. There's some reforms that could be done there. We were just in this morning having further conversations around that. I think enabling First Nations to hold title to lands directly rather than going through some convoluted processes in some cases. So a number of those reforms can streamline things. I appreciate that the federal government has the Ecological Gifts program, which provides important tax incentives for people who make donations of conservation easement agreements or the fee simple, the full title of those parcels. And the province is also supporting some acquisitions, and that's very much appreciated. I think rounding out support for the full range of landscape conservation and the full range of activities, not only the purchase price, but some of the other transaction costs that municipalities and land trust are incurring, would be worthwhile. And that creates, to really enhance that partnership with senior governments and local governments and Indigenous governments, can really help us move the yardsticks further.
Martin, if you would allow me to chime back in for a minute, I just want to thank both Ian and Denise. And in particular, I'd pick up, Denise said it very well, and I'm afraid I'm not going to going to say it better, but I think what she said was hugely important, that in a way, we're trying to change minds and culture as much as anything. I talked about the business case at a micro level, and Denise said, wait a minute, there's a business case at a macro level. Like, what's the land budget case? How many million acres do we need for urban development? Really, how much do we need? And how much farmland can we protect? And as much as anything, we need, Martin, I'm sorry, I'm straying away from the subject of the seminar with sort of tools available, but at a very large scale, you're moving to a kind of educational, cultural mindset change where you want to be able to, of course we protect farmland. Are you crazy? What are you talking about? Of course, in this culture in Ontario, we protect farmland, and we take all these steps that are necessary to do that. And knowing, as Denise suggested, that there's still lots of land for everything else we need.
Yeah, if I might pick up on that too, Paul, the provincial policy statement as it currently stands calls for planning ahead for future supply of housing, but we don't necessarily plan ahead for future supplies and sustainable supplies of farmland and natural heritage systems. We have some elements of that, but not nearly as strong as the housing imperative, and some further balance on a sustainability or a resilience perspective would be helpful.
That relates to a point that Denise made earlier in our discussion. She was questioning, what about these private landowners making a private decision that will permanently change the nature of that land use? And whether it was totally effective, I'm not sure, but my answer was, when someone decides to do a severance or a land development, they're permanently changing the use of that land. And we need to legitimize a private decision, cooperation with government and community, to permanently protect farmland or other natural resources.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that comes back even to one of our earlier webinars that we had talking about the balance of farmland preservation and meeting the needs for housing and development as well, from the perspective that as we are trying to develop more housing to make sure that, one, it is available and affordable, the issue being that housing and shelter being a very basic need for human survival, so is food and clean air and clean water. And we can't, if we're sacrificing the use of land of one basic necessity just to meet the need of another one, we're not going to be any farther ahead. So we need to have those real critical conversations now before, as I had said at the start of the presentation, once we pave over this land, that's it. It's done. We can't use it for those services that it provides us with those other basic needs. Thank you, Paul, Denise, and Ian. We're going to now shift gears a little bit and open up the floor to questions. I don't see any, one did just pop in to the question chat now. What are the panelists' thoughts on a provincial moratorium on foreign ownership of farmland?
Panelists don't think about that. I wouldn't be able to comment on that. I just haven't. It's not a question I've looked at. I don't know if we have data on how much foreign ownership is there and whether it's a problem. Maybe the questioner has more information on that, but I couldn't really comment on I know they do that in Prince Edward Island and Saskatchewan. I don't know if we need it in Ontario.
Yeah, I would say we have some examples certainly of foreign ownership in the area where I practice, both within urban boundaries and outside. And I think there can be challenges associated with that, but I wouldn't want to comment it on an overall level as to, pros, cons, should it be stopped at this point.
I would like to note that where there are Americans that own Canadian farmland, that they can work with organizations such as American Friends of Canadian Conservation to make a donation and get really leveraging US tax benefits to support Canadian farmland. So where there are those circumstances, there's some tax opportunities to support conservation.
Thanks, yes, and a complex and challenging question to start us off on this. But thank you, Jane, for your question. I'm also just going to scroll through the chat box quickly here and see some other comments that have come through. One of the earlier ones from Vicky just asking to discuss the farm in perpetuity, as in the restrictions which can prevent future farmers from buying the land for farming. And Vicky, I sent a note to say that you can certainly follow up with me with more questions about this. But just to confirm, when we have conservation easement agreements on a property, that's not going to restrict a future farmer from buying that for farming. The intent is actually that it's available for future farmers for farming. But if there's any clarification questions, please certainly feel free to follow up. Let's see here.
Martin, if there isn't another question immediately, I just pick on a point we didn't have time for during the session, and that is thinking about working with municipal councils. That it's interesting, sometimes the municipal councils want the land trust private organization to work with them and put conservation agreements on land. And it's typically, well, it will be, it's municipal governments who are interested, who share the objective of long-term protection of farmland and natural areas. So we have, I gave the example earlier of York Region cooperating and helping fund those kinds of tools being used within York Region. And in a different landscape, the Georgian Bay Land Trust is a very, I mean, it's obviously not farmland, it's just rock, but it's valuable recreational rock. And the local government there really supports land conservation and the work of the local land trust. So, and in a funny way, we talked at the beginning about the distinction between the planning system, the public decisions, and the private work of the land trust. But sometimes the municipal councils don't trust what a future municipal council will do, and they want to be sure that land is permanently protected in whatever planning exercise they're involved in, and will work with the land trust to get that permanent protection, because the conservation easement is not subject to a zoning amendment application or a land appeal tribunal hearing. So it's permanent in that sense. It takes it outside of the municipal planning process.
That's all. We do have another question coming up. Gina's saying that they're a bit confused. Conservation started by encouraging conservation, or sorry, the conversation started by encouraging conservation easements. But as the hour has gone by, I'm hearing more against easements of farmland. Who wants to try to clarify what we have been exploring in terms of easements? I have a thought, but I'm going to turn it over to the panelists first.
Sure, Gina, I think it's the goal to sort of an exploratory discussion. And I think the message certainly from myself would be that, conservation land easements in the right places, I think with collaboration with overall land use planning and that broader discussion about, various considerations and whatnot, I think they certainly can be appropriate. So not suggestion that we're not in favor of conservation land easements. It's more about getting them into the right places so that they can be really effective.
And I might add that it's using them certainly in the right places and the right circumstances, And then working with partners that are experienced with conservation easements, like the Ontario Farmland Trust. They know how to work with landowners, work with municipalities and other governments, and also manage those, be in relationship with those landowners as time plays out. And there are Canadian land trust standards and practices that guide land trusts to be good managers of those conservation easement agreements in conjunction and good relations with the landowners.
Okay. A follow-up question from Gina. How can we help determine the right places?
I think that's the broader discussion about where I think the Dufferin Rouge Preserve is a great example of a place. There could be many others. If we think of different countryside lines and where we're trying to, ensure that certain parcels, if there's the desire of that landowner, if it, not to say that it has to fall in line with a municipal council's desire, but as Paul said, if it does, there could be a really strong support for that conservation easement to go forward. I think the example I would give, something that's perhaps not in the right place, we think about where we did have conservation land easement applied to property that was within the growth boundary. I think that can be difficult. I think it can send some mixed messages. There's clearly competing priorities happening there. So I think sometimes it's easier to pick out the places that maybe aren't the right spots as opposed to the ones that are. But I think that's the point of today, is to think about how can we advance that conversation and have more discussion about this.
Mm-hmm. And I think we have time for one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Are there municipalities in Ontario currently using mechanisms, such as the 1% land tax mentioned in Maryland, that would allow for the purchase of conservation farmland to, as Denise said, hold the line of the municipality's growth boundary? And how do we convince municipalities that that's a good idea?
The Maryland example is a percentage of the state land transfer tax. So in our context, would be a provincial funding mechanism. I mentioned York Region a couple of times. They're an example of a region that does take a percentage of their tax revenue and devote it to conservation land securement. I think there are others. I'm not sure if Waterloo is doing that. Ian or might know. But I don't think it's specifically directed at the urban boundary. It's at land conservation more generally. And as Denise has been saying, you want to be careful about it. If it's got a broad public consensus behind it, you might use it at the urban boundary, but you don't want to use it to stand in the way of sewer and water service areas that are actually planned by the municipality.
I think there are those examples in Durham and Halton and Peel as well, Paul, perhaps Hamilton as well, that are funneling some of their resources. I know that the city of Peterborough, in the recent update of its official plan, has identified a funding mechanism, basically part of the general budget, and developing particular policies to guide securement, as we might call it, conservation easement agreements, or purchasing of the fee simple full ownership in the municipality. And I think other municipalities are looking at that. It'll depend on their geography and their priorities. But certainly prime agricultural lands, those lands that have the continuing agricultural infrastructure, important natural heritage lands as part of the system, will be important ones to look at.
Martin, one part of that question was, how do you convince the municipality? And I'm not sure that I will remember all the details of this correctly, but this goes back like 20 years. There were surveys conducted, like public opinion surveys conducted, to show to the politicians in York Region, your constituents support this. And in the United States, there's an organization called the Trust for Public Land that does very extensive public surveys in support of bond issues in the States. So that's beyond, I think, the scope of what we've done in Canada, but they will test and then propose a bond measure to raise money for land conservation acquisition. So it's a matter of convincing the local politicians, with whatever tools you have available, that your constituents are actually going to support this and want it.
Excellent point, Paul. So here we're coming up where we've just hit 1 o'clock. So I'm going to try to do a quick summary here and some key takeaways. I certainly think, like, while I was listening to Paul and Ian and Denise speak about some of these both high-level goals that we have to be able to achieve, some of this like more coordinated efforts to have a higher degree of impact on conservation. I'm thinking about how this is coming at it from both this conservation easement perspective as well as this policy perspective. And it's interesting that at the start of the presentation, I was talking about some of the work that OFT does, both obviously with all the work we do with farmland conservation, but being heavily engaged in policy as well, and how critical it is to be commenting and engaging in the changing policy landscape around agricultural uses. So I think it's safe to say that OFT certainly feels like we are in a position to be working with municipalities, and there's a lot of takeaways that we have here to understand that a lot of work needs to be done and a lot of coordination needs to be done. But certainly, I think from the OFT's perspective, being in a position to be able to work with municipalities to achieve their conservation goals is a really critical takeaway for me from this. But I'm also going to pose this to all of our attendees to think about how you might advance this type of conservation in your local communities as well, either by encouraging municipalities to reach out to OFT and to think about, or maybe not just OFT, but other local land trusts as well, to think about how we might be able to explore this further, develop relationships and share opportunities that we think might be applicable to our local context. And of course, hopefully someday get to a point where we would be collaborating on this long-term approach and efforts to be able to protect farmland as well as environmental features of our communities. Up on the slide here, we've listed a few more ways that you can get involved. You can certainly remain up to date on OFT's work by following us on our different social media channels. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. And we also post these recordings of our webinars on our YouTube channel as well. As the Land Trust, we're a charitable organization, so we're able to do these types of initiatives thanks to the support of our donors. So you can always become a donor and help support the work that we do. OFT's also launched a new volunteer program. So there's a volunteer tab on our website. So if you're interested, there's some more information there. And of course, we also have other events that are coming up as well that we promote on our website and on our channels. For example, we have one more webinar coming up in January, talking about land access programs and supporting the next generation of farmers. And in May, we have March, we have our annual Farmland Forum as well, where we're talking about the changing landscape of Ontario's farmland. And I just want to wrap up thanking Ian, Denise, Paul for taking time to come and share your expertise and insight on this. Thank you to all the attendees who've come and have, obviously have expressed an interest in this type of a conversation. So we really appreciate your attendance. And of course, to our supporters who helped make this webinar series possible, who we have listed up here on our slide. And of course, if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. There's our contact information is on our website as well, which you can see the link for here on the slide. There's also the Ontario Land Trust Alliance, which is a great resource to understand more about land trusts and how conservation easement agreements work as well, and different types of programs that are out there for landowners interested in conservation. And of course, Ian had mentioned the Ecological Gifts Program. Certainly, if you want to find out more information about that, a quick Google search will provide a lot of really great results for you. So with all that being said, thanks again, everybody, for participating today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next winter webinar. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Martin.